Welcome to Bezel Chess, everyone. Today we are going to watch a game that was played in 2007 between Viswanathan Anand and Magnus Carlsen. And this is in many ways prime Anand at his peak of his career and young rising star Magnus Carlsen. So in the game, Anand is playing this as white and Magnus is playing this as black. E4, E5, knight f3 attacks the central pawn. Black defends it. Black defends the central pawn with development. Bishop b5. Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish, one of the oldest openings in chess. So the idea is to pressurize the knight, which protects the pawn. So indirectly, it's to pressurize black's e5 pawn. And now a6 move was played. This is called the Morphy Defense, named after Paul Morphy. And white simply cannot take a pawn here by eliminating the knight. The reason being black gets this double attack, and once the knight falls back, queen takes on e4 check, and this is very equal. And as white, you want to push for advantage. So instead, this variation wasn't played. It was bishop a4, one of the main moves to maintain advantage. Now knight f6, and as if you have noticed, many Ruy Lopez players, they don't play d3 or knight c3. The reason being, the plan in the Ruy Lopez is to construct this big center with the help of c3. And if you play d3, if you play d3, then the tempo is lost. Later, when the pawn moves to d4, the tempo is lost. And when the knight is played to c3, there is no c3. So typically it's castles, and bishop e7 is the closed Ruy Lopez. If knight takes e5 here leads to open Ruy Lopez, but we don't want to get into opening theory here. Let's stick to the game. Bishop e7, closed Ruy Lopez. And because white's idea is to play c3 and d4, it's neither knight c3 or d3. Instead, it's rook e1. Now b5, and this is where the move order or the moves become very important for black. I've seen many players castle here as black, which is a mistake, because now the e4 pawn has a defender. Rook defends the e4 pawn, so now bishop can just take the knight, and now knight takes e5, and now this will not work, this double attack, because knight f3 attacks the queen, and maybe queen goes back and white enjoys one extra central pawn. So that's the reason b5 was played before castling. Bishop b3, and now d6 by Magnus. So this is protecting e5 and getting ready to develop the bishop. c3 by white. And by the way, this is a great bishop to have here, but black cannot chase down this bishop. Black simply cannot chase this bishop immediately because the e5 is hanging. So once d6 is played, this is when knight a5 is possible to exchange the knight for the bishop. So only now c3, multi-purpose move. Bishop has an escaped square if knight attacks the bishop, and also prepares d4 in the game. So castles by black. h3, because if you play d4 immediately, the pin on the g4 square is annoying. Now, and in this position, it gets a bit complicated. D4 pawn is under a lot of pressure, and if you don't see what's happening, if you just play something like h3 here, can take, and they'll take on d4, and eventually knight takes d4. This is bad. Or you are forced to take with the pawn and ruin your kingside structure. This way, the d4 pawn is still protected by the queen, but the king is exposed. So again, not desirable. So when the bishop pins the knight, it practically forces white to play d5 in this position, and here knight a5 targets the bishop, and immediate c6. So it becomes very easy for black to challenge white's central pawns here. So that's the reason before playing d4, the standard move here is a h3, and now knight a5 anyways, attacking the bishop. This is called the Chigoran defense by black. Attacks the bishop, and in the Spanish opening or the Ruy Lopez opening, the light square bishop is very important. So bishop is preserved. Although for now the bishop is not doing very well, but eventually you will see that the bishop will do a great job. Maybe not in this game, but usually in many games the bishop does a brilliant job. In this game, later on, only at the end the bishop enters the attack. So in the game, bishop c2, c5 by black, trying to take more control of d4 square. White plays d4. Knight d7, interesting move. So idea is maybe in some lines f5 might be an idea, but opens up the bishop. But I think the main idea is to shift the knight to the queen side. That's the main idea. d5, Anand closes the center. This way he keeps the space advantage. And because Anand is a more strategic player, more positional player, he likes closed positions like this. So when you have a closed position, a closed center, the game tends to be more strategic and more maneuvering kind of a game. So that's the reason d5, it suits his style. Knight b6, and now knight d2. And this knight needs to go to a better square, of course. It's for now it's blocking the bishop. And in the Ruy Lopez, typically the knight goes to f1 and g3, the standard square, and from here the knight has some interesting knight has access to some interesting squares. So g6 by Magnus. Now interesting, Anand just played b4. Magnus takes. He could close. He could Magnus takes on b4. C takes b4, and the a knight comes to c4. Good knight. Knight takes knight. Knight takes. Otherwise, this pawn is weak. It's split from black's other pawn. So in effect, although technically this is not isolated, but in effect it's very much weak, just like an isolated pawn, because it's not, and it cannot be a part of a pawn chain. So that's the reason only knight takes. Now the knight on c4 is very good. So Anand immediately attacks the knight, and now the knight goes back. The reason being, if you ignore this, again the pawn is weak. And if you try to defend the knight with queen c7, there's a simple move. We can just play this. Bishop h6, attacking the rook. And if the rook moves somewhere, rook e8 looks interesting. Rook c1. This is too much. It's not a good idea to have the queen on the same file as the enemy rook. So in this case, there's a pin and there's a threat to take. And yeah, eventually if a black plays something, we'll end up in a desirable position where this pawn is a weakness. So we'll have fun here. White will have a lot of fun. So for that reason, Magnus just puts his knight back. And now you might still say the bishop is not the best piece on the board, but always have faith on the light square bishop if you're playing the Ruy Lopez. That's a very good rule. Maybe immediately the bishop is not doing very well, but eventually the bishop does a great job. In the game, it's bishop e3, keeps an eye on the knight. Bishop d7 by Magnus, developing the bishop. He connects his major pieces on the back rank. And now I'll give you a few seconds to pause. Try to find what white should play here. It's an obvious move. Okay, I hope you found Anand's move. It's rook c1. He puts a rook on the open file, in fact the only open file, and he tries to take control of it. Magnus attacks it, and now Anand wants to get more control over the c file, and his strategy, of course, there are many ways to do it. He can also play queen d2, just making sure that if the rook takes, the other rook can take. But in this position, he saw something even better. He saw rook takes. He understood that rook takes on c8 is better because the queen cannot take the rook because the bishop is looking at the knight. So that's the queen has to babysit the knight. So instead, in this game, it was bishop takes, and now immediately queen c2, not queen c1, queen c2, because you can also play rook c1 later and double up the rooks on the c file. So bishop d7, and now rook c1, and now this is very dangerous. If white is allowed to infiltrate, this is big trouble now. There's a disconnection between the queen and the bishop, and there's pressure on this knight, and if you just exchange, now the knight is under attack and the bishop is under attack. So this is losing on the spot. This is losing. This is a big advantage for white. So instead, a very sad little move was played. The knight had to go to the corner. So Magnus Carlsen's knight went to the corner, stops the queen from infiltrating, but this is probably the worst possible. Corners are the worst possible squares for knights. If a knight on the edge is a donkey, then knight in the corner is even worse because it's only covering 2 squares. Now queen d2. So Anand has a different strategy, and this is the reason Ruy Lopez is the favorite of many top grandmasters, because white tends to play on all sides of the board. White can potentially play on the queen side with a4. White potentially has some advantage in the center. White can try to get an attack on the king side. So white has a lot of these options. So there's a good reason why this is a favorite of many grandmasters. So in the game, it's queen b8. So the idea is to challenge the c file. But in doing so, the queen is going away from the king. This is important. Now bishop g5. Now the dark squares around the black king are weak, and if the bishops are traded, if the dark square bishops are traded, this becomes even more weak. The dark squares become even more weak. So bishop takes bishop, knight takes g5. So after knight g5, we have rook c8 challenging the only open file on the board, and this shows the higher level positional understanding of Viswanathan Anand. What should white play here? I'll give you a few seconds to pause. In the game, he completely vacates the c file and he plays rook f1. His idea is to play f4, so on, open up the f file and try to attack the black king. A very typical idea in the Ruy Lopez, and like I said, in the Ruy Lopez, white can potentially play on the king side, in the center, in the queen side as well, depending on the position. Here, since a lot of black's pieces are concentrated on the other side of the board, the attack on the king side makes a lot of sense. A very good position, a very good understanding of position. And now h6, it turns out to be a big mistake because knight is not going back to f3. Instead, the knight goes to e6. This is a big problem for Magnus. If he takes on e6, d takes e6, and the bishop is under attack, Anand would just recover material. And if bishop goes back to e8, Anand would also take the pawn on h6. So he recovers 2 pawns, and the king is in a horrible position, and there's always a threat of a discovered check like this. This is a big problem. It's highly unlikely that black survives this. So instead, king h7 was played, keeping an eye on h6 pawn. h6 pawn now has defense, and now f4. And now if black takes, again white would attacks the bishop. This is important detail. White can recover material, so bishop has to move. Black can't do anything else. And now f4. f5 can be played. And if black takes, and now white has these two connected passers very close to the black king, and if the knight tries to enter, this is a huge problem. These two pawns, connected pass pawns, are very close to the black king. They'll help us to get a huge attack. At the same time, if one of them gets through, we'll get a new queen. We'll get a second queen. So for that reason, this is losing. So Magnus, he rejected this. He played bishop e8, and now Anand just plays f5. He's not even sorry, my bad. So in the game, it's bishop king h7, f4, queen a7 check, but white king finds safety on h2. Bishop goes back to e8, defends f7 pawn, and mind you, again it's the same story. If they take again, there's two pawns close to the black king. They'll two connected passes very close to black king. They'll help us to get an attack, and if one of them gets through, we'll get a queen again. So this was rejected, and that's the reason bishop e8 was played. Now f5. Again, if black takes, white is guaranteed to get two connected passers. So for that reason, Magnus takes on f5, and white takes back on f5, and now he plays f6, a sad little move which cements the knight on e6 now. And on the other hand, if Magnus takes, it's the same story again. These two pawns they'll win the game for Anand. So for that reason, f6 was played, and now it's only a matter of time and technique here. Now rook e1, knight is challenged. Now Anand takes control of the c file again. So he vacates, now he takes back the c file again. Knight is pinned. If knight moves, rook falls. So there's a pin on the c file. So bishop attacks the knight. Rook c3, a very good rook lift. So the rook can shift to g3 square. Now e4 was played. Black is trying to get some counterplay, but it's just desperate. Now rook g3. So now the rook is involved in the attack. Now at last the knight is gone. The strong knight on e6 is gone. But now I'll give you a few seconds to pause. How should white take? With the f pawn or with the d pawn? So I hope you found the answer. It's with the d pawn. The reason being, if you take with the f pawn, this bishop is not going to find the bishop is not going to be very active on this diagonal. Maybe the bishop can still do well on this diagonal, but taking with the d pawn is much better because the bishop has this diagonal, and this is going to be critical. Bishop is under attack, so bishop falls back. And now white decides to push, and this is very interesting. If queen takes on e7, bishop g8 check, king has no choice but to go back to the corner, and now queen h6 check, forcing the queen to block and checkmate. So this leads to a forced checkmate. So instead in the game, it's bishop h5. So the rook is covering the back rank, but now Anand just takes on d6, protects the e7 pawn. Now e7 pawn has solid protection. Then f6 is going to fall, and then there's still a big attack on the king. So in this position, Magnus resigned the game, and a brilliant win for Anand. Thanks for watching.